In 1402, the Ottoman Empire lay in ruins. The mighty Mehmed I, known as the Thunderbolt, had fallen to Timur, and his sons tore the dynasty apart in a brutal civil war. For more than a decade, the empire bled, fractured between rival princes, each battling for the throne. And yet, from the ashes of chaos, one man would rise. In 1413, Mehmed I emerged as victor, no longer just a claimant, but the Sultan. His mission was not conquest, but restoration. To rebuild what had been broken, to reunite Anatolia, stabilize the Balkans, and prove that the House of Osman was not destined to vanish into history. In this episode, we uncover the remarkable story of Mehmed I, the Restorer Sultan, who pulled the Ottomans back from the brink of extinction and set the stage for centuries of empire. The year was 1402. On the dusty plains near Ankara, the lightning of Mehmed I, the Thunderbolt, was extinguished. Timur, the conqueror from Central Asia, shattered the Ottoman army, captured its sultan, and left the dynasty in ruins. What followed was a decade of chaos, a time the Ottomans themselves would remember simply as the Fetret Devri, the interregnum. Bayezid's sons turned against one another, each claiming the right to rule. Suleiman held power in the Balkans. Isa governed Bursa. Musa fought from Rumelia. Mehmed, the youngest, carved out his claim in Anatolia. Brothers battled brothers, armies clashed endlessly, and the empire that Bayezid had built in lightning campaigns seemed destined to break apart. It was not a war of glory but of exhaustion. Cities were sacked not by foreign invaders but by rival Ottoman princes. Vassals defected, tribute ceased, and Constantinople breathed easier, convinced the Ottoman menace had destroyed itself. For 11 years, the dynasty teetered on the edge of extinction. Out of this chaos emerged Mehmed. He was not the eldest son, nor the most obvious heir. Born around 1386, he had grown up in the shadow of his father's brilliance and the tragedy of his capture. Unlike his brothers, Mehmed was cautious, calculating. He learned to bide his time, to wait for weakness, to strike when the moment was right. In a world where haste meant ruin, his patience was his greatest weapon. Mehmed's early years in the interregnum were marked by survival. While his brothers exhausted themselves in open wars, Mehmed consolidated in Anatolia. He forged alliances with local beyliks, rebuilt shattered towns, and slowly gathered loyal forces. His court in Amasya became a refuge for scholars, warriors, and administrators who believed the dynasty could be restored. To many, he seemed less like a warlord and more like a shepherd, guiding what remained of the Ottoman flock through a storm. The decisive moment came in 1413. Musa, the last serious rival, was defeated near Kamerlu. Mehmed emerged from the battlefield not just as victor but as sole survivor of a fratricidal generation. He was proclaimed Sultan, ending the interregnum and reuniting the Ottoman state under a single banner. His accession was not triumphant in the manner of conquerors. There were no sweeping new lands, no dazzling sieges. Instead, it was an act of healing. Mehmed inherited not an empire but a broken body, fractured and bleeding. His task was not to expand but to restore, not to dazzle but to endure. Chroniclers later gave him a title as modest as it was profound: Kirisi Sultan, the Restorer. It was under Mehmed that the Ottomans proved they were not a flash of lightning destined to fade, but a dynasty with roots strong enough to weather catastrophe. The tone of his reign was set from the very beginning. Unlike his father Bayezid, who had struck swiftly and harshly, Mehmed ruled with patience and care. He knew that ambition had destroyed his brothers, and overreach had undone his father. His task was different: to rebuild the legitimacy of the Sultanate, to convince subjects weary of war that the Ottoman state could endure. When he ascended the throne in Edirne, he was neither the most feared nor the most celebrated sultan. But he was the one who gave his people what they craved most: stability. After a decade of fratricide and foreign humiliation, Mehmed's quiet authority felt like relief. Thus began the reign of Mehmed I, the unlikely prince who restored his father's broken empire. His story is not one of dazzling conquest, but of endurance, diplomacy, and the slow reknitting of a torn fabric. In his patience lay the survival of the dynasty, and in his restoration lay the foundation for centuries of empire yet to come. When Mehmed emerged as the sole victor of the interregnum in 1413, he inherited something far more fragile than an empire. What lay before him was a fractured state. Anatolia divided among resentful beyliks, the Balkans restless under shaky vassalage, and subjects exhausted from a decade of fratricidal war. Where Bayezid I had commanded lightning strikes across Europe, Mehmed faced the quieter, heavier burden of reconstruction. His throne was not secured by conquest alone. It had to be held together by trust, patience, and legitimacy. Restoring authority. The first task was political healing. The Ottoman dynasty had nearly destroyed itself through civil war, and memories of betrayal were still fresh. Nobles and governors who had once backed his brothers watched Mehmed cautiously. He could not rule as a tyrant, striking down every rival, for his state was too weak to bear more bloodshed. Instead, Mehmed ruled with restraint. Former enemies were pardoned, their lands restored, provided they pledged loyalty. This policy of reconciliation was both pragmatic and symbolic. The era of fratricidal chaos had ended, and a new age of unity had begun. But reconciliation did not mean weakness. Mehmed was careful to demonstrate that he alone was sovereign. He consolidated his rule in Edirne, re-establishing it as the imperial capital. Here, the Ottoman court once more became the seat of government, radiating authority into both Europe and Anatolia. From Edirne, Mehmed issued decrees, confirmed Timar grants, and dispatched judges and governors, slowly weaving together the torn fabric of empire. Rebellious vassals. Yet not all accepted his rule so easily. In Anatolia, rival beyliks sought to reclaim their independence. The Karamanids in central Anatolia, long rivals of the Ottomans, bristled against Mehmed's authority. He moved swiftly to check them, marching into their lands to enforce submission. These campaigns were not as dazzling as his father's lightning wars, but they were steady, reminding Anatolian lords that the Ottoman Sultan remained the center of power. In the Balkans, Serbian and Bulgarian vassals, who had once been bound to Bayezid by fear, tested their new master. Mehmed reasserted their tribute obligations but tempered harshness with pragmatism. He needed their loyalty more than their destruction. By allowing Christian lords to retain some authority, he ensured that tribute flowed without sparking rebellions the fragile empire could ill afford. The problem of legitimacy. Perhaps Mehmed's greatest challenge was legitimacy. The interregnum had shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded the dynasty. Europe had seen Ottoman brothers at each other's throats, their empire torn to pieces. To restore confidence, Mehmed leaned heavily on symbolism. He emphasized continuity with his grandfather Mehmed I and his father Bayezid I, framing himself as the rightful heir who had preserved the dynasty from extinction. Religious legitimacy also played a key role. Mehmed funded mosques, madrasas, and dervish lodges, presenting himself as a pious sultan chosen by God to restore order. Preachers praised him as the ruler who had ended civil war, a bringer of unity after chaos. To weary subjects, this narrative resonated. After years of devastation, stability itself felt divine. Careful balance. Mehmed's temperament distinguished him from his father. Bayezid had been fiery, impatient, and merciless in his speed. Mehmed was deliberate, cautious, often described as reserved in demeanor. He preferred negotiation before battle, reconciliation before bloodshed. This did not mean he lacked resolve. When rebellion arose, he crushed it, but he chose his battles carefully, understanding that the survival of his dynasty depended not on dazzling expansion but on measured endurance. This careful balance was visible in his governance. Taxes were enforced consistently but not excessively. Timar grants were carefully distributed to secure loyalty among the cavalry. Janissaries were maintained but not expanded recklessly, ensuring their loyalty without provoking unrest. For common subjects, this meant a reprieve from the endless wars of the interregnum. Markets revived, fields were sown again, and trade routes regained some security. The empire's heartbeat, faint during the civil wars, grew steadier under Mehmed's rule. The atmosphere of renewal, Chroniclers writing in his time often emphasized the relief of his reign. Villages burned by fraternal wars were rebuilt. Merchants once again carried goods across the Balkans and Anatolia. Scholars and clerics who had fled the chaos returned to court. Edirne blossomed as a capital once more, its mosques and bazaars alive with activity. Mehmed's authority was not absolute. He ruled a state still fragile, still vulnerable to rebellion and external threat, but it was recognized. For the first time in over a decade, the Ottomans had one sultan, one banner, one court. A different kind of strength. In these early years, Mehmed I proved that strength was not always measured in victories on the battlefield. Sometimes it was measured in patience, in forgiveness, in the ability to hold steady when ambition tempted ruin. He was not the thunderbolt like his father. He was something subtler, quieter. The restorer who understood that empire, to endure, must sometimes pause, breathe, and heal. By the mid-1410s, Mehmed had secured his throne, reasserted control over vassals, and rebuilt the authority of the Sultanate. The Ottoman state, once shattered, now stood whole again. Modest in size compared to Bayezid's empire, but stronger in unity. The stage was set for the next phase of his reign. Cautious expansion, diplomacy, and the strengthening of institutions that would carry the Ottomans into the future. For Mehmed I, expansion was not a matter of glory, it was a matter of survival. The empire his father Bayezid had left behind had been vast but brittle, collapsing under the weight of its own ambition after the disaster at Ankara. Mehmed understood that to rebuild the dynasty, he could not chase lightning like his father. Instead, he waged war like a craftsman, measured, deliberate, and always with an eye toward consolidation. His campaigns in Anatolia and the Balkans were not explosive surges, but careful strokes that gradually reassembled the Ottoman state into something more durable. The Anatolian challenge. Anatolia was his most immediate concern. The defeat at Ankara had torn the region apart. Local beyliks that Bayezid had subdued, Karaman, Jermian, Aydin, and others, had reasserted their independence, each backed by Timur's patronage or emboldened by Ottoman weakness. These principalities were not mere neighbors. They were rivals who could undermine Mehmed's fragile authority if left unchecked. Mehmed moved with prudence. He did not attempt to conquer all of Anatolia at once. Instead, he targeted strategically. In 1414, he launched a campaign against the Karamanids, the most powerful of the Anatolian beyliks and longtime rivals of the Ottomans. His forces pressed them back, compelling their ruler to submit, though never permanently. Karaman would remain a thorn in the side of the Ottomans for decades, but Mehmed's intervention reminded Anatolia that the dynasty was not broken. Elsewhere, Mehmed used diplomacy as much as arms. He confirmed marriages and alliances, granting beyliks a measure of autonomy while quietly re-establishing Ottoman supremacy. Rather than forcing immediate annexation, he wove a web of loyalty and tribute, buying time for his empire to heal. This blend of diplomacy and limited warfare stabilized Anatolia without overextending his resources. The revolt of Sheikh Bedreddin. Not all threats came from rival lords. In 1416, Mehmed faced a crisis from within, one that revealed just how fragile his empire still was. Sheikh Bedreddin, a scholar and mystic who had once served as a judge under Musa, sparked a religious and social revolt. Preaching equality and the sharing of wealth, he gathered followers among peasants, dervishes, and discontented soldiers in both Anatolia and the Balkans. His message resonated with the weary and the poor, threatening to ignite a movement that could unravel Mehmed's careful restoration. The rebellion spread quickly, alarming both Ottoman officials and local elites. Mehmed responded with firmness. His generals crushed Bedreddin's followers in battle, and the sheikh himself was captured and executed in 1420. The suppression of this revolt was a turning point. It reaffirmed the authority of the Sultan and signaled that ideological or social movements that challenged dynastic rule would not be tolerated. Mehmed's empire might be fragile, but it would not be undone from within. The Balkans, careful reassertion. In Europe, Mehmed faced a different challenge. His father's campaigns had stretched Ottoman authority deep into the Balkans, but the interregnum had given local lords space to reassert themselves. Serbia, Wallachia, and Albania all tested the weakened empire. Mehmed's task was not dramatic conquest but gradual reassertion. He began with diplomacy. Serbian despots were confirmed as vassals, their autonomy tolerated so long as tribute flowed. Wallachian princes were courted, their rivalries manipulated to ensure that none could grow strong enough to resist Ottoman influence. In Albania, Ottoman garrisons secured key towns while local clans continued to govern. This pragmatism paid off. Tribute began to flow again, and Balkan vassals, though restless, recognized that Mehmed offered stability they could not find elsewhere. Where Bayezid had demanded submission through terror, Mehmed offered a quieter but steadier authority. Naval expansion. Mehmed also recognized the growing importance of naval power. The Aegean had become a battleground of influence, contested by Venetians, Genoese, and local Anatolian rulers. By supporting his vassals in building fleets and strengthening control of coastal towns, Mehmed laid the groundwork for the Ottomans' eventual naval presence. Though his reign did not see spectacular naval victories, it planted seeds that later sultans would harvest. A strategy of patience. Through all these campaigns, Mehmed's strategy remained consistent. Fight only when necessary, secure loyalty through diplomacy where possible, and never overextend. His reign lacked the dazzling expansion of Bayezid, but it provided something the dynasty needed more urgently: stability. By the early 1420s, Mehmed had reasserted Ottoman authority across much of Anatolia, crushed the Bedreddin revolt, and stabilized the Balkans. Tribute flowed once more, armies marched with discipline, and subjects began to believe again in the permanence of the dynasty. The Restorer at war. Mehmed's wars were not wars of spectacle but wars of restoration. He did not seek to dazzle Europe with thunderbolt victories. He sought to convince his subjects that the Ottoman state was whole, legitimate, and enduring. Every battle won, every treaty signed, every rebellion crushed was a step toward that goal. In this, he succeeded. The empire that had nearly collapsed after Ankara now stood firm again, modest in ambition but solid in foundation. The Ottomans were back. Not yet the terrifying superpower they would become, but no longer a dynasty on the brink of extinction. Mehmed's reign of careful campaigns and measured diplomacy proved that empires do not always need lightning to survive. Sometimes, what they need is patience, healing, and the steady hand of a restorer. If Mehmed I's armies restored Ottoman borders, it was his politics and religion that restored Ottoman legitimacy. The interregnum had not only shattered territory, it had shaken faith in the dynasty itself. To rule after such chaos, Mehmed had to convince subjects, vassals, and rivals alike that the House of Osman still carried divine sanction, that the Sultan's authority was more than brute force. He achieved this through careful governance, law, and piety woven together into a new foundation of rule. Rebuilding authority. The most immediate political challenge after 1413 was centralization. During the interregnum, local lords and governors had grown accustomed to ruling independently. The dynasty's authority had been reduced to whoever commanded loyalty at a given moment. Mehmed needed to reverse this trend. He did so not by sweeping decrees but by gradual assertion. He reappointed judges, qadis, reinstated tax registers, and carefully restructured the timar system. Land grants, once abused during the chaos, were redistributed to loyal sipahis, tying them firmly to his court. By making landholding dependent on the Sultan's favor, Mehmed reminded his elites that their fortunes flowed only from him. In the Balkans, vassal rulers were confirmed in their positions, but under strict tribute obligations. Mehmed balanced carrot and stick, accepting their autonomy but demanding loyalty, punishing rebellion swiftly when it arose. His ability to hold together Christian vassals without provoking constant revolt demonstrated a pragmatic political instinct. It was better to bend slightly than to break entirely. The court and administration. Mehmed also strengthened the Ottoman court as a center of legitimacy. Edirne, restored as the capital, became once again the administrative and symbolic heart of the empire. Here, scribes recorded decrees, scholars debated law, and viziers advised the Sultan. Though modest compared to later grandeur, Mehmed's court radiated stability after years of fratricidal anarchy. He cultivated loyalty among his viziers and military leaders, rewarding competence over bloodline. In this, Mehmed set a precedent. The Sultan's court was not merely a family affair, but a meritocratic institution where ability could elevate men to power. This broadened the base of support for the dynasty, ensuring that Ottoman governance did not depend solely on fragile kinship ties. Law and justice. A critical pillar of Mehmed's rule was law. The interregnum had produced an atmosphere of arbitrariness. Taxes levied inconsistently, judgments rendered by whichever prince held sway, justice dependent on faction. Mehmed sought to restore order. He reaffirmed the dual system of governance, Sharia, Islamic law, guided by religious scholars, complemented by canon, sultanic decrees that regulated taxes, land, and military obligations. By balancing divine law with pragmatic decree, he created a framework that could govern a diverse empire of Muslims, Christians, and Jews. Justice, though firm, was perceived as more predictable under Mehmed. Rebellions were punished swiftly, but everyday disputes were settled in courts rather than by arbitrary violence. This restored faith among subjects that the state, though heavy, could also be fair. Religion and legitimacy. Mehmed's reign leaned heavily on religion to rebuild legitimacy. He cultivated the image of a pious ruler, supporting mosques, madrasas, and Sufi lodges across his territories. His patronage was not ostentatious. His reign was too short and resources too strained for monumental projects, but it was steady. In Bursa and Edirne, he endowed mosques that became community centers, binding urban life to the dynasty. Soup kitchens, emirats, fed the poor, dervish lodges offered spiritual solace, and madrasas trained scholars who would serve in Ottoman courts. These institutions reminded subjects daily that the dynasty was both protector and provider. The suppression of Sheikh Bedreddin's revolt in 1420 also carried religious significance. Bedreddin's call for radical equality had challenged not just political authority but the religious orthodoxy that underpinned it. By defeating him, Mehmed reaffirmed that the Sultan was the guardian of Islam's order, not an innovator or heretic. His victory was framed as both political and spiritual, strengthening his aura as divinely favored. A sultan of balance. Unlike his father Bayezid, whose fiery personality shaped his rule, Mehmed was remembered as calm, measured, even modest. Chroniclers note his humility, his preference for simple dress, his devotion to prayer. Yet this modesty masked a shrewd political mind. He balanced mercy with severity, autonomy with centralization, faith with pragmatism. He understood that his empire was not yet strong enough for reckless expansion. Instead, his priority was to heal wounds, to bind disparate elements into a whole, to rebuild the legitimacy of the dynasty in the eyes of both subjects and rivals. The return of confidence. By the late 1410s, Mehmed's careful politics bore fruit. Tribute flowed from vassals, Anatolian beyliks recognized Ottoman primacy, and the Sultan's decrees carried real authority again. His people, weary of chaos, began to believe once more in the permanence of the dynasty. It was not yet an empire of grandeur or terror. It was an empire of restoration. But in that restoration lay the seeds of future greatness. Mehmed had proven that the dynasty could survive not only conquest but collapse, not only triumph but near extinction. In politics and religion alike, he had balanced the scales, rebuilding what was broken, reasserting the dynasty's claim, and restoring faith in the House of Osman. When Mehmed I brought the interregnum to an end in 1413, the Ottomans were weary. For over a decade, civil war had ravaged the land. Villages had been burned by rival princes, markets disrupted by endless conflict, and families divided by shifting loyalties. The task that fell to Mehmed was not only to restore political order but to restore the rhythms of life. His reign, though short, offered subjects something they had not known for years: stability. Markets revived. The most immediate change came in the markets. Under the interregnum, trade routes had been dangerous, tolls imposed arbitrarily, and merchants hesitant to travel. With a single sultan once more on the throne, roads grew safer. Ottoman garrisons patrolled highways, Caravansaries reopened, and merchants slowly regained confidence. In Edirne, the capital, bazaars filled again with goods. Anatolian silks, Balkan grain, wool, and wine, spices brought through Genoese ports. The silver aki, now minted consistently under Mehmed's name, circulated widely, re-establishing a sense of economic unity. For peasants carrying wheat to market or craftsmen selling tools, Mehmed's rule meant coins that held their value and trade that no longer collapsed under war. The rural world. For villagers, life was measured in seasons, and Mehmed's restoration brought a reprieve from chaos. Fields once abandoned to war were replanted. Taxes, though heavy, were now collected consistently rather than by whichever prince's soldiers happened to ride through. The Timar system, restored under Mehmed, tied local sipahis to the land, offering peasants a measure of protection. Christian communities in the Balkans, who had seen rival Ottoman princes extort them during the interregnum, now faced a single sovereign. Tribute was still required, but the predictability of Mehmed's rule was a relief compared to the chaos that had preceded it. Continuity, even under foreign rulers, was preferable to endless war. Religion and daily faith. Religion once again became a stabilizing force. Mehmed supported mosques and madrasas, but also tolerated the continued functioning of churches and monasteries. Orthodox priests continued to serve their flocks, while dervish lodges spread through villages and towns, offering both spiritual guidance and a sense of community. In Edirne and Bursa, mosques echoed with the call to prayer, while Sufi orders like the Mevlevis and Bektashis gained influence, blending mysticism with daily piety. These lodges also provided food and shelter, drawing in both the poor and wandering dervishes who spread Ottoman authority through spiritual presence as much as political decree. Charity and public works. Mehmed invested in vakifs, charitable endowments that funded soup kitchens, baths, and schools. In cities, emirats served bread and stew daily to the poor, travelers, and students. Public fountains were endowed for fresh water, while caravansaries sheltered merchants. These acts were not mere charity. They were reminders that the dynasty still provided, that even after civil war, the Sultan's hand reached into daily life. For the common subject, the empire was felt less in royal proclamations than in the bowl of food at an emirat or the safety of a caravan route. In this sense, Mehmed's restoration was lived most deeply in these small but vital gestures. Cultural continuity. Despite the turmoil of the interregnum, cultural life endured, and under Mehmed, it began to flourish again. Poets returned to court, their verses praising stability after years of strife. Scholars debated law and theology in newly funded madrasas. Calligraphers inscribed Quranic verses in mosques, blending Seljuk, Persian, and Byzantine influences into what was becoming a distinctly Ottoman style. Architecture during Mehmed's reign reflected modest restoration rather than grand innovation. Mosques built under his patronage were smaller than those of later sultans, but they carried symbolic weight. Each new dome and minaret was a statement that the dynasty had survived. In Edirne, markets and mosques alike testified to the rebirth of urban life. Life in the capital. In Edirne, daily life reflected the empire's diversity. Turkish officials walked alongside Greek merchants, Armenian craftsmen, and Jewish traders. Languages mingled in the bazaars. The Sultan's presence was visible in soldiers on patrol, judges in court, and officials in the palace. But the city's life pulsed with many traditions. For ordinary residents, Mehmed's rule meant a fragile but genuine peace. After a generation scarred by civil war, the return of routine, market days, festivals, weddings, was itself a profound change. A culture of caution. What defined Mehmed's era culturally was not spectacle but healing. He did not build monumental mosques to rival Byzantium, nor launch campaigns that filled chronicles with triumph. Instead, he nurtured small acts of continuity. Steady coinage, functioning courts, open markets, funded soup kitchens. For the empire to endure, these were the foundations that mattered. And so, under Mehmed, life regained rhythm. Villages sowed and reaped, cities traded, students studied, dervishes prayed, and families marked the cycles of birth and death in relative calm. It was not an age of dazzling splendor, but it was an age of restoration. For a people who had survived the chaos of the interregnum, this was enough. For much of his reign, Mehmed I had been the healer of empire, the quiet restorer who stitched together the torn fabric left after the disaster at Ankara. But no ruler, however cautious, could escape the toll of time. As the second decade of the 15th century drew on, the weight of age, illness, and the burden of constant vigilance began to press heavily on the Restorer Sultan. His final years were marked not by conquest, but by a struggle to ensure that what he had rebuilt would not collapse once more. The toll of rule. Mehmed had come to power in exhaustion, his own and that of his state. Years of campaigning against brothers, rivals, and rebels had hardened him, but they had also drained him. Chroniclers describe him as modest in demeanor, often somber, more comfortable in prayer than in courtly spectacle. By the late 1410s, illness increasingly shadowed him. Sources differ on the nature of his sickness. Some speak of weakness in his chest, others of long fevers, but all agree that by the final years of his reign, his health was failing. Yet he continued to rule. He still received petitions, issued decrees, and oversaw campaigns, but the strain was visible. His officials, aware of his condition, began to whisper of succession. The dynasty had only just survived the chaos of fraternal war. Another crisis could undo everything: the question of heirs. Mehmed had several sons, each with potential but also with the dangerous legacy of rivalry. He knew well the price of divided succession. The interregnum had been born of too many claimants and too little unity. He was determined to avoid repeating the mistake that had nearly destroyed the dynasty. Of his sons, Murad stood out as the most promising. Strong, capable, and already entrusted with administrative and military duties, Murad had the qualities of leadership. By the late years of Mehmed's reign, he was positioned as the heir apparent. Yet the risk remained. The Ottoman tradition of fratricide and succession by strength meant that other sons might challenge him. Mehmed's final years were haunted by the possibility that his careful restoration could dissolve again into civil war once he was gone. Managing the balance. Despite his failing health, Mehmed continued to manage both Anatolia and the Balkans with characteristic pragmatism. In Anatolia, he kept a wary eye on the Karamanids, ensuring they did not exploit his weakness. In the Balkans, he maintained tribute from vassals, careful not to push them into revolt. But it was increasingly his viziers and generals who carried out the details of governance. Mehmed's role became more symbolic, a figure of unity whose presence reassured subjects that the fragile balance of restoration still held. The shadow of Bedreddin's revolt. The memory of Sheikh Bedreddin's rebellion in 1416 continued to weigh heavily in Mehmed's later years. Though the revolt had been crushed, its radical call for social equality had revealed how easily discontent could spark in times of instability. Mehmed worked quietly to strengthen religious legitimacy, funding clerical scholars and ensuring that Sufi orders aligned with the dynasty. Yet beneath the surface, he knew his reign had not erased the deep fractures of his society. Decline and death. By 1420, Mehmed's illness worsened. Court chroniclers note that he appeared rarely in public, and when he did, he was frail. He retreated more often into prayer, preparing for what he must have known was the end. Still, he took care to ensure his chosen heir, Murad, would be recognized upon his death. He entrusted loyal viziers and commanders to support Murad's succession, hoping to avoid another fratricidal catastrophe. In 1421, Mehmed I died in Edirne. His reign had lasted only 8 years, but in that brief span he had rescued the dynasty from near annihilation. His death, however, was met with both grief and apprehension. The empire he left behind was restored but fragile. Would his heirs preserve it, or undo it once more in rivalry? A fragile legacy at the end. Mehmed's final years revealed both his greatest strength and his greatest vulnerability. He was a ruler of patience, reconciliation, and healing, but his state remained precarious. The institutions he restored, the Timar system, the Janissaries, the authority of the Sultan, were functioning, yet still young. His heirs would face the test of whether they could hold together what he had so carefully mended. For his people, Mehmed's death was the end of a reprieve. He had given them stability after chaos, bread after famine, and peace after war. But his passing raised an anxious question. Had the dynasty been truly secured, or had it only been granted a pause between storms? When Mehmed I died in 1421, he left behind no vast empire of dazzling conquests, no monuments that pierced the sky like those of his successors. His reign had lasted scarcely 8 years, brief compared to the sultans who would follow. And yet, in that short span, Mehmed carved out a legacy as vital as any in Ottoman history. He was not the conqueror who expanded borders, nor the lawgiver who codified empires. He was the Restorer Sultan, the man who saved the dynasty itself. The dynasty survives. To grasp the weight of Mehmed's legacy, one must recall the state of the empire in 1413. Timur's victory at Ankara had shattered Bayezid I's lightning-built dominion. His sons plunged the dynasty into civil war, dividing Anatolia and the Balkans among themselves. For 11 years, the empire existed only in fragments. Europe rejoiced at what seemed the end of the Ottoman menace. Anatolian beyliks reclaimed their independence. Byzantine emperors imagined a new lease on life. Few believed the Ottomans would endure. Yet endure they did because of Mehmed. By outlasting his brothers, by reconciling enemies, by exercising patience where others had indulged in fury, he pulled the dynasty back from the brink. When he ascended the throne in Edirne, he did not inherit an empire, he rebuilt one. That alone marks him as one of the most consequential sultans. The restorer, not the conqueror. Mehmed's reign is remembered not for spectacular victories, but for restoration. He reasserted control over Anatolian rivals, crushed the revolt of Sheikh Bedreddin, and re-established Ottoman suzerainty in the Balkans. He did not expand dramatically, but he stabilized profoundly. His father had chased glory at Nicopolis and fallen at Ankara. Mehmed chose the opposite path. Deliberate caution, healing wounds rather than opening new ones. In that choice lay the salvation of the empire. Institutions rebuilt. Equally enduring was his restoration of institutions. The Timar system, frayed during the interregnum, was restructured to secure cavalry loyalty. The Janissaries, shaken by fraternal wars, were reaffirmed as the backbone of the Sultan's power. Courts once again balanced Sharia with canon, ensuring both divine law and pragmatic decree. Vakifs endowed mosques, schools, and soup kitchens, binding daily life to the Sultan's beneficence. These were not spectacular achievements, but they were essential. Without them, his successors could not have expanded or glorified the empire. Mehmed's reign laid the groundwork upon which later sultans would build. Faith as legitimacy. Religion, too, was central to Mehmed's legacy. He cultivated the image of a pious ruler, modest in dress and devoted in prayer. His support for mosques, madrasas, and dervish lodges reinforced his legitimacy as God's chosen servant. In defeating Sheikh Bedreddin's radical movement, he reaffirmed orthodoxy and positioned the Sultan as guardian of the faith's order. For subjects weary of chaos, his rule carried not only political but spiritual reassurance. A different kind of heroism. History often celebrates rulers for boldness, for conquests that redraw maps. Mehmed's heroism was quieter, less dramatic, but no less vital. His reign reminds us that survival can be as heroic as victory. Without Mehmed's patience, the dynasty might have splintered into petty states, remembered only as another failed house of Anatolia. Instead, he ensured that the name of Osman endured, that the dynasty would live to challenge empires for centuries. The transition to Murad II. Mehmed's death in 1421 left the throne to his son, Murad II. The succession was not without turbulence, but Mehmed's careful preparation allowed Murad to take power without the catastrophic fratricidal wars that had scarred the interregnum. Under Murad, the Ottomans would resume expansion, pressing deeper into the Balkans and preparing the way for even greater rulers to come. In this sense, Mehmed's reign was a bridge between collapse and resurgence, between fragility and strength. Without his steady hand, there might never have been a Murad II, a Mehmed II, or an Ottoman Empire that spanned continents. The restorer remembered. Later generations of Ottomans remembered Mehmed with a kind of quiet reverence. He was not celebrated in epic poems like conquerors, but his memory lingered as the sultan who had preserved their very existence. His tomb in Bursa became a place of solemn respect, a reminder that empires survive not only by sword and fire, but by patience and faith. Legacy. Mehmed I's legacy lies in endurance. He showed that after collapse, restoration is possible. After division, unity can be reclaimed. He proved that dynasties can survive defeat, humiliation, and near annihilation if guided by steady leadership. His reign did not blaze like a thunderbolt. It glowed like a steady flame, keeping the dynasty alive until it could burn brightly again. When history tells of the Ottomans' 6 centuries of rule, Mehmed I's name may not gleam as brightly as Suleiman the Magnificent or Mehmed the Conqueror. But without him, their stories would never have been written. This was Mehmed I, the Restorer Sultan, the man who saved an empire from extinction and ensured its survival into the centuries to come. This was the reign of Mehmed I, the Restorer Sultan. From the ruins of civil war, he pulled the Ottomans back from the edge of extinction. He reunited Anatolia, steadied the Balkans, and proved that the dynasty of Osman could endure even its darkest hour. But Mehmed's story was only the beginning of a new chapter. When he passed in 1421, the throne passed to his son, Murad II, a ruler who would take the fragile state his father restored and push it once more toward expansion, glory, and relentless struggle. In our next episode, we uncover the life and reign of Sultan Murad II, who would carry the Ottoman Empire into the mid-15th century and prepare the way for its greatest conqueror yet.